Daern, Chapter 2, Flashpoint, Part 2, Gail. Stupid, stupid, stupid. He'd been repeating the word to himself for the better part of an hour. Every few minutes he would take a break from the constant negativity by repeating strings of encouraging phrases his old friend Sivo had drilled into his head as a youth. He had loved Sivo, but honestly Gail hadn't believed in positive thinking then, and didn't believe in it now. There was also the fact that there was just no way to spin wandering into a labyrinth of bogs and boulders with nothing but a couple dozen vegetables strapped to his back as a smart idea. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Oh, come on, Gail cursed. Everything below his left knee vanished into slimy green mud. Like a grisly skin, a thin layer of moss and dirt covered the bogs, which made it nearly impossible to tell what was solid ground anymore. Wandering into the maze had been pretty easy. Getting out was proving to be another story. Gail slumped down on the sliver of dry land behind him and pulled. With a disgusting squelch, his leg came free. He squeezed off as much of the gunk as he could, but it just stuck to his hands instead. Cursing the mud and every foul thing that swam in it, he trudged on. He tiptoed around the edge of the bog, testing each suspicious bit of ground before placing his weight. The practice was tedious and frayed his nerves. If the Mulronyo didn't catch up to him first, he would probably end up at the bottom of the marsh, if there is a bottom. With every step he half expected the mud to just reach up and swallow him whole. He crawled over a small ridge of stone that separated this bog from the next one. He was relieved to see that the new bog looked to be more watery than the last. Maybe he could just wade through it rather than walk around. He drew his sword and held it above his head, and slipped down into the brackish water. A fresh cloud of mosquitoes rose and buzzed around his ears. Spring floods had carved out these stone-lined pools, and the native streams had deepened them, until each had grown separate from its neighbors. It reminded Gail of animal tracks, where each dent left by a claw or paw pad was filled with rain. He pushed on through the water, feeling a little bitter as the mud sloughed off his legs. Behind him came the soft plop of stones, dropping into the pool. He whirled around, brandishing the sword wildly. But there was nothing there, just as there had been nothing there every time this had happened. Stupid. He rose out of the pool like a bedraggled sea creature and looked for his next obstacle. With a start, he realized there wasn't any. The road was just ahead, atop a high ridge. He'd spent so many hours with his head down, scrutinizing his uncertain footing, that he hadn't even noticed how far he had come. I made it. Only a thick patch of reeds and cattails stood in his way. He plunged ahead, losing sight of the road as he entered the reeds. They grew above his head and sprang back against his touch, swatting him in the face and chest. A flock of birds suddenly rose from the reeds to his left, twittering indignantly. His head snapped up at the movement, right as a dark shadow charged him. Wham! Gail gasped as all the air was forced from his lungs. His ribs flexed and creaked as his body was sent flying. With a splash he landed in the water, where he lay flapping on his back like a stranded fish. He flipped over, drew in several painful breaths, and looked up. Like a creature from his nightmares, Gail's attacker rose from the reeds. The monster before him had the shape of a man, though the lithe frame moved with a grace that no human could hope to mimic. The body was encased in dull brown leather. Cuirass, bracers, and greaves all conformed to his body like a second skin. Gail, however, couldn't take his eyes off the face. A leather mask wrapped its entire head, like the carapace of some monstrous insect. The leather torn and tortured into hideous shapes that rose off its brow like horns and mandibles. Only the eyes were clearly visible, glittering maliciously. The elves had caught him at last. "You dropped something," the Mulronyo whispered, holding up the sword that Gail had taken from them during his escape. His ears prickled as a hideous growl filled them. He turned and saw another two Mulronyo step out from behind the rocks. Between them a hound strained against its lead, long ropes of saliva hanging from its jowls as it anticipated tearing into him. Blood pounded in his ears as he struggled to get to the shore. Moving like lightning, one of the Mulronyo drew a club and struck, slamming the heavy weapon across his shoulders. His teeth came together with a sharp clack as he landed face first in the mud of the shallows. He thrashed as the elf's boot pushed his head deeper into the suffocating muck. Bright lights appeared behind his eyelids as his lungs screamed for air. Panicking, he fought. He clawed at his attacker's leg, fingers grasping at the strap of one of his greaves. "Let him up," whispered the first Morano. Gail gulped down air as the pressure on his head lifted. The Morano kicked him in the ribs, chuckling. He yelped and lay groaning on his side as the three devils leered down at him. The eyes of the first Morano watched him coldly. Squatting, he dragged Gail up by his dirty hair like a misbehaving pup. "Game's over. Hey, look at me. I said look at me, you little shit." He shook Gail with each word. Gail tensed, refusing to look up. Even when the elf pressed the sword beneath his chin and forced his face upward, he squeezed his eyes shut, determined to deny him even this small amount of respect. He could almost feel the elf's fury radiating off of him. When next the elf spoke, his voice was shaking with poorly concealed emotion. "You afraid? Is that it, you coward? Afraid to look at me?" A thin line of blood crawled down the edge of the sword, but Gail remained perfectly still. The dog whined impatiently at the smell. "You should be after what you did." Starting in the bruised soles of his feet, a warmth had begun to build. It spread upwards, sinking into his aching calves like a balm. It felt good, and oddly familiar. Where have I felt this before? Gail finally opened his eyes and looked up into the Morano's mask. His stomach felt as though it were full of snakes, but his voice was quite steady. "And what exactly did I do?" The Morano's pale green eyes bulged. He released Gail's hair and shoved him. The elf's slender fingers opened and closed on the hilt of the sword as he leveled it over Gail's right shoulder. "You killed my brother." Gail blinked and felt some of the heat fade from his limbs, as he thought of the fourth Morano's bloody arm lying on the ground back in the forest. He died? But he was I didn't mean to. "By once you're alive. Never said nothing about whole," the Morano said, raising the sword while the others stood by. Their anticipation was palpable. "Seems a fair trade, didn't I think?" "An arm for an arm," the Morano grinned. The dog would eat well tonight. Gail would probably be made to watch. "It's not fair." As though his rage were a breath of fresh air, the heat in his limbs reignited, burning in his muscles like an inferno. "This cannot be how it ends." His skin bubbled as though the heat within was searching for an escape. The sword fell, and Gail jumped. He soared up through the air faster than an arrow from a bow. So fast his brain could not keep up with what his senses were telling him. The air rushing past his face was surely the sword falling on his shoulder. The sudden splash of water had to be his own body crashing to the ground. But it wasn't. He was looking down at the Morano. He was jumping clear over the Morano's head. The elf watched him, the leather of his mask creasing as his mouth fell open. Gail laughed hysterically. "I've lost it." His feet brushed the tops of the reeds, and he landed with a crash, his knees almost buckling beneath him. Like ripples in a pond, pulses of heat coursed through his legs, propelling them forward with inexorable force. In just 2 bounds he was nearly to the top of the embankment. Gail leapt up the last stretch with such strength that his own momentum nearly sent him flying over the road and down the far side. Behind him, the dog was howling, no doubt frustrated to be cheated out of a good meal. His baying was nothing compared to the ruckus the elves were making. Gail backpedaled, steadying himself on the lip of the ridge. With a roar, the lead Morano tore up the hill. He dove at Gail, swinging the sword wildly. Gail sidestepped him with ease, his feet sliding effortlessly across the hard-packed dirt. The elf sped past him, falling head over heels down the far side. Without breaking stride, Gail bounced off the balls of his feet and took off. Not into the unknown distance, but towards Stone's cradle. His feet might have well as sprouted wings. The world flew apart, the landscape becoming no more substantial than the first strokes of paint on a canvas. A blur of green and gray pigment, bleeding into each other across the horizon. Only the road seemed real, but rose and fell beneath him, resisting the pounding of his feet. "Shoot him! Shoot him!" a voice screamed. Gail never knew if they tried to shoot him. He left them behind in mere moments. He realized he was still laughing. The painful sound tore its way out of his throat, where it quickly died in a drawn-out wail. Tears followed close behind, nearly blinding him as they rolled down his cheeks. He cried for himself, and for the elf, who had died weeping and clutching the ragged stump of his right arm back in Alston Erin. He wept because he remembered what he had done. He hadn't needed the sword. The arm that had restrained him in the dark hadn't been cut. Gail hadn't done anything so civilized. I tore it off. Laird, I tore it off. The last light of day faded as Nostiarn veiled the sun overhead. He became aware of a faint glow surrounding his legs like a golden nimbus. He refused to look down, afraid of what he might see. His nerves began to calm. The nimbus of light grew dim, and his pace slackened. Stone's cradle loomed ahead, its great boulders black and foreboding in the darkness. At their base, though, other lights bloomed, casting shadows on the stone. Figures seemed to dance across the dead rock, their bodies stretching into monstrous proportions in the unnatural light. He felt the thunder of hooves vibrate through his feet, and heard the deep voices of men yelling in the darkness before him. For a second he saw them, cruel men astride colossal horses, parading through the ugly flames of their victory. Flames? Gail saw it clearly now. Stone's cradle was on fire. Thanks for listening to Daern, a story in progress. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. And if you really enjoyed it, consider donating through Patreon. Any amount will go a long way towards helping us bring more content to you. Links to our Patreon and our website are in the description. See you next week, and have a good one.